Hello and welcome back. Today we've got a really fantastic explainer lined up for you. We're going to uncover the hidden machinery of international finance. It's a system most of us never actually see, yet it's quietly running in the background of our everyday lives. It dictates the prices of the things we buy, the stability of the companies making them, and frankly, the overall economic health of the nations we live in. We're going to take a journey today, starting with the incredibly simple act of buying your morning coffee and going all the way up to the massive global institutions that basically keep the world's economy afloat. Okay, let's dive into this. Have you ever stopped to wonder how a sudden political event happening quite literally halfway across the globe could possibly affect what you pay for that cup of coffee in your hand? Well, it all starts with this fascinating micro to macro narrative. Because we live in a highly interconnected global economy, right? For a consumer in the US to just, enjoy a fresh brew made from Brazilian beans, a massive chain of financial events is instantly triggered. To really grasp this, we first have to look at the globalized consumer and how interconnected trade networks dictate what's actually available on our store shelves. And this brings us to a fundamental rule of global trade, a domino effect, if you will. The movement of goods across national borders always requires the movement of money in the exact opposite direction. Think about it. When a buyer in the US purchases that coffee from Brazil, the coffee doesn't just magically appear. The US buyer has to send money to the Brazilians. But here's the catch. They can't just send US dollars to Brazil and call it a day. Those dollars must be exchanged for the local currency. So this single, everyday transaction instantly drops us into a colossal global marketplace. To make that currency exchange happen, we enter the world of Forex. Foreign exchange, often just called Forex or FX, is the global marketplace where currencies are traded against each other, and it is the absolute largest and most liquid financial market in the world. Being that liquid means it's incredibly easy to buy and sell currencies without suddenly spiking or crashing the price. Its entire purpose is to facilitate all this international trade and investment we've been talking about just by enabling the seamless conversion of one currency into another. But as you might guess, navigating this ocean of money isn't always smooth sailing. Companies face some massive risks trying to operate in this space. Let's zoom out from our coffee-drinking consumer to the corporate level for a second. How exactly do companies manage to survive and even thrive in this unpredictable currency marketplace? Well, what's really interesting here is the structure of the market itself. It is entirely decentralized. There isn't a central exchange building or some chaotic physical trading floor you can go visit. Instead, it operates entirely over the counter. All these transactions happening around the clock are done electronically through this vast, incredibly intricate network of banks and brokers worldwide. And operating in this interconnected web brings two major challenges. First up is foreign exchange risk, sometimes called currency risk. This happens because exchange rates change so rapidly. Say a US company sells goods in Europe, right? If the euro's value suddenly drops before they can convert that money back to dollars, their anticipated revenue simply shrinks. It's just gone. Then on the other hand, we have political risk. This is the risk of financial loss due to political instability or sudden changes in a government's policies. We're talking about things like the nationalization of assets, civil unrest, or contract repudiation, which is just when a government refuses to honor a legal agreement. Both of these risks can critically impact a company's ability to operate across borders. So, with all that unpredictability, how do businesses build a shield to protect themselves against these global uncertainties? They can't just cross their fingers and hope for the best, right? They have to actively protect their operations to keep consumer prices somewhat stable. One of their absolute strongest tools is something called hedging. Hedging involves using financial instruments, like options or futures contracts, to essentially buy an insurance policy against those wild currency fluctuations. So, if a company knows they're going to be paid in euros in 6 months, they can use a futures contract to lock in an exchange rate today. That way, if the euro suddenly takes a nosedive, the revenue isn't completely destroyed. It is absolutely crucial for navigating those unpredictable financial waters. But hedging is just one piece of the puzzle. Businesses actually rely on a broader toolkit. They use diversification, meaning they spread their operations, their investments, and their supply chains across multiple countries and currencies. This way, they reduce their exposure if any single market fails. And to protect against those severe political risks we mentioned, like expropriation or political violence, companies can actually go out and purchase explicit political risk insurance. Having this comprehensive, multi-layered shield is really what allows multinational corporations to confidently operate around the globe. All right, let's zoom all the way out now to the absolute macro level of international flow. We know consumers buy goods, and we know companies hedge their risks. But who exactly writes the rules for this massive web of money and products? Well, that rulebook is called the International Monetary System. Think of it as the core operating system of the global financial environment. It's this established set of conventions and rules that supports cross-border investments, trade, and the flow of capital between different countries. It literally defines how exchange rates are set and how the balance of payments, which is essentially a nation's financial checkbook, is handled between countries. It's the framework that keeps this highly complex machine running smoothly. Let's move through time a bit and see how this builds, because the central element of this system, how exchange rates are determined, has evolved drastically. Back from 1880 to 1914, we operated on the gold standard, where currencies were directly tied to a fixed amount of actual gold. Later on, to rebuild cooperation after the Great Depression and World War II, the Bretton Woods system was established in 1944. This introduced fixed exchange rates. But that system ultimately collapsed in 1971. And ever since then, we've lived in a world of floating exchange rates, where market forces freely determine the value of currencies relative to one another. Now, when this monetary system gets out of balance, countries can face some severe economic struggles. One of the biggest issues is inflation. Inflation is simply a persistent rise in prices, and it usually happens when there's too much demand chasing too few goods. This directly erodes the purchasing power of everyday consumers. Navigating inflation, along with things like poverty and mounting national debt, is incredibly difficult for any single nation to manage all on its own. Which naturally leads us to ask, who steps in as the referee to maintain global stability? When nations struggle with those massive economic imbalances, they turn to the International Monetary Fund, or the IMF. And I want to highlight a number for you, 190. Today, there are 190 member countries that make up this institution. That is a massive, nearly universal scale. It really just goes to show how globally coordinated our financial safety systems have to be to maintain any kind of order in modern trade. So the crucial point is understanding exactly what the IMF does for these 190 nations. Its core functions are entirely focused on stability. First off, it provides financial assistance. It loans money to countries facing balance of payments problems, which often requires those countries to adopt structural adjustment policies, like altering their government spending or tweaking their tax systems to get back on track. Second, it conducts international systems surveillance. It actively monitors the economic and financial policies of all its members. And third, it focuses on capacity development, basically providing technical training to central banks so they can manage their own economies more effectively. It is genuinely fascinating how interconnected it all truly is, isn't it? We started with the simple act of buying a cup of coffee and ended up exploring a 190-nation financial safety net. So next time you buy an imported good, I want you to ask yourself, how heavily does this everyday purchase rely on this invisible global machinery? Because from those over-the-counter currency exchanges to the corporate hedging strategies, all the way up to the IMF surveillance, it all works together to put that product right in your hands. Thank you so much for joining me on this explainer, and definitely keep asking those big questions.